So today we're finishing off chapter 27. We're beginning from verse 39, and then we'll cross into the beginning of chapter 28, which is the last chapter here ultimately of the book of Acts. So we're right at the tail end. The ending of 27 is really just historical details being filled in, as it were, and then a synopsis of their time on the island of Malta is what we'll then work through and read through to the end of verse 10 in chapter 28. Okay, so let's read and go from there. So Acts chapter 27 verse 39 to chapter 28 verse 10. Now when the day came, they could not recognize the land, but they were noticing a bay with a beach, and they were resolving to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders. And hoisting the foresail to the wind, they were heading for the beach. But striking a reef where two seas meet, they ran the vessel aground, and the bow struck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. Now the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention, and ordered that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. And when they had been brought safely through the shore, then we learned that the island was called Malta. And the natives showed us extraordinary affection, for because of the rain they had set in, and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. But when Paul gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. And when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, "Undoubtedly this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." However, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. But they were waiting for him to soon swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, changing their minds, they began to say that he was a god. Now in the areas of the place that were lands belonging to the leading men of the island, named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius was lying afflicted with fever and dysentery, and Paul, going to see him and having prayed, laid his hands upon him and healed him. And after this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and were healed. They all bestowed on us many honours of respect, And when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all that we needed. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, so as I mentioned, we're traversing the chapters here, and the ending of 27 details the shipwreck itself, and then these 10 verses that we have here in the beginning of chapter 28 give a synopsis of their time. If you just look very briefly at chapter 28 verse 11, the next sentence beyond what we read, we see that they were on this island for 3 months. Okay, they're on Malta for 3 months, right? So we'll explain that as we work our way through. Okay, obviously it brings this entire ordeal at sea to a close, and then it continues on ultimately past this passage, which we'll cover in the coming 2 weeks specifically. So let's begin in verse 39 of chapter 27. So now when the day came, when daybreak came, which is where we left off last week, they could not recognize the land. Right? They didn't immediately recognize it. Whether none of them had been to Malta before, that's possible, or just simply being so disoriented as to exactly where they'd landed. Had they landed in Malta? Had they landed in what we call today Sicily, right, the southern portions, right, Magna Graeca, as it was often known in the ancient Hellenic world. They weren't quite sure. But either way, they don't recognise the land. And they were noticing a bay with a beach, and they were resolving to drive the ship onto it if they could. Okay, so to come ashore, obviously not docking or anything else, that's obviously not going to happen at this point. The ship's already been torn apart enough as it is. They're just simply looking to intentionally wreck themselves so that they can at least try and get to land or as close as they can. And casting off the anchors, verse 40, they left them in the sea while they at the same time were loosening the ropes and the rudders. This is part of, again, we covered this at least in passing, trying to explain it last week, where they're attempting to lighten the ship, A, so they don't sink as quickly, and B, so that they can hopefully gain as much speed into it that they can actually maintain that shipwreck on either the reef or elsewhere, even the beachhead itself, if they can manage that. And hoisting the foresail to the wind, they were heading for the beach, vis-a-vis what I'd said. Verse 41, but striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the bow struck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the force of the waves. Yes?
It says in this one, they committed themselves onto the sea in number 40.
Verse 40. Read the full verse for me.
And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves, in italics, into the sea and loosed the rudder bands.
The them in reference is the anchors, so they committed them, the anchors themselves. If it says themselves, that would be that'd be an odd English translation. No, it's definitely referring to the anchors themselves. Yeah, left them in the sea or committed them to the sea. In other words, they left them.
Yeah, after casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea.
Yes. Yeah, if it has themselves, it's an odd one. Don't know why it would do that. But no, the them in view is the anchors, not the people. Yep. That's fine. So it mentions they strike a reef where two seas met. This is typical parlance for a channel. Okay, so you're not going to be able to. Obviously, the island of Malta on these maps that I have for you is quite small, of course. On the north side of Malta is what is still to this day known as St. Paul's Bay. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. And
there's
then,
two channels they could have gone in on that.
yeah, the channel that's in view, you are correct, is that on the north side of the bay there is an island,
I see it.
which is called St. Paul's Island.
I see it.
It's largely tidal, not exclusively. It's not like Lindisfarne, but there is many reefs. It's obviously very rocky island, and the channel between there is filled with reef. Okay, and so this is where this actual wrecking itself occurred, and the bay by extension gets referenced as well. It's not big at all. Obviously, I mean the whole island's not big.
I wonder if they've dived it looking for the remnants.
Very good question. No idea.
Probably something left.
Yes. Malta is, yeah, I mean, suppose so. I mean, X amount.
Bronze fittings, all that sort of stuff.
Things like that would be the only things that after 2,000 years would ever have survived. Yeah, I have no idea. I haven't looked into it. Malta is kind of a main island, and then there's a smaller island on the north, or I guess really northwest side, I suppose you'd call it. There is then an island between those two. There is an island between that channel. The island I'm referring to is actually a much tinier island in St. Paul's Bay. Okay. It's hard to kind of demonstrate without
You've got
having it.
Comino, which is the one that's between.
That's the
islands,
art.
and
Yeah.
Gozo, which is the bigger, or the more northern.
Yeah, that's part of this archipelago. Yeah, and so this is a very tiny island, but it's down in the bay that to this day is called St. Paul's Bay. Hard to visualize. Didn't think to do specific maps, but nevertheless.
It's just on Google Maps.
Oh, there you go. Fair enough.
Yeah,
you'd be able to very easily look up on Google Maps thanks to modern technology.
St. Paul's Bay, yeah.
So you're looking at Google Maps there. Okay, yeah, it's on the north side of the main island, right, of Malta.
Yep.
And you'll see St. Paul's Bay, and then there's a little island just on the north side of the bay with a channel. Right? That's what's being referred to, okay, historically speaking.
Right in the middle of the two islands. Is that the one?
No.
So?
No.
So go to St Paul's Bay. You're on the north
Yep.
side. Yep.
Yep.
And then on the north side of that bay, St Paul's Bay. See, there's an island. It's
Like-
relatively
almost like
thin.
two little
Ah,
ones.
tiny little one.
Two
Tiny,
Yes.
yes.
And it's called St Paul's Island.
That one.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So if my memory serves me, there's a statue of Paul there and a cross and
Yeah, the statue,
ruins and other
yeah,
such
it's-
things.
It's even place marked on Google Maps.
Oh, there you go. Fair enough then.
Is that the spot they think traditionally they landed, where the statue is on?
That's where, well, yes, at least historically, according to tradition, yeah.
Okay. They've sort of done a bit of a hook turn there then. I mean, maybe.
Yeah. All of that area around there is very, gets quite shallow. The reefs run quite hard there, from memory. But nevertheless, that bay is called St Paul's Bay after that, as a result of that.
Very cool.
They run the Gressel Vound, and as I mentioned again, the bow digs in well, but then the stern is then having massive problems and just basically is ripping the ship apart with the moving of forces, right?
Being
As we-
smashed by the waves too. That's,
Correct, yeah, exactly,
It
yeah.
tears the whole front off oil tankers.
Exactly. So verse 42, now the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. Common, might seem harsh to us, but killing prisoners trying to escape has been a fairly universal thing. And that's there to stop them escaping, especially if they're murderers, they're thieves, they're rapists, they're who knows what. But nevertheless, them not having them escape into the local population is something that the Roman soldiers obviously want to maintain. But in verse 43, the centurion, the one that we've seen before throughout this chapter, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention, right? So he managed to convince them through ordering them. He orders that they stay, but rather that anyone who can swim, and jump overboard first and get to land. Obviously, X amount of them can swim, X amount of them cannot.
It would be pretty treacherous even if you could swim because.
Oh, of course.
There's a
Yep.
reef, yeah.
Yep, all of the above, yeah. But the alternative is 100% die in the shipwreck, or potentially die in the waves.
I mean, what about the weight of armour and swords and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean they will have dumped a lot of
got
that.
rid of all that?
Yeah, you're not jumping into that water in armour. Yeah, I mean a Roman soldier. It'd been a while since I would have looked at that, but a Roman soldier would be 30-ish kilo. Yeah,
30 kilos.
yeah.
Wow.
At least, probably more, 30, 40. Some of their heavy cavalry, yeah, 30 to 40, depends on what time period you're talking about.
Yeah.
At this point, first century, early Principate.
You could
30,
go to
40,
the plank option or the barrel, I suppose, and just hopefully there's enough flotation for you and your bundled armour. Because
Yeah, I mean,
when you get
they've...
ashore, you still want your sword.
Yeah, exactly, and they do that. He orders that those who can swim do it, jump overboard and swim first to land. And then in verse 44, verse 44, the rest should follow and summon planks, right? So planks of wood and other various things, barrels, etc. They again insert things like that, boxes, whatever. And so it happened they were all brought safely to land, right? So they all actually managed to survive. The 276 of them that we had referenced back up in verse 37, the end of verse 37.
That in itself is pretty amazing. 236 people in the ocean on a reef, and all of them got in alive and not drowned or dashed.
Yeah, oh no, exactly, you're 100% right.
My verse 37 is actually where it says how many, it's in brackets, like it says we were in all 276 persons in the ship, and that's kind of in
In parentheses. No idea. I'd have to look.
That's
That's
the
a
English
while.
Standard Version.
Yeah, I have to look as to why that would be the
Three
case.
score and 16.
What does yours say?
203 score and 16.
Yes,
And 3 score and
older
16,
score.
yeah.
Yeah, older score. Yeah, 3 scores in 20. So yeah, 2, 7, 6. Yeah. Why that specifically is in parentheses, I have no idea.
Mine isn't.
Mine's not. No, mine's not either. But nevertheless, Certainly, at least from the manuscript
Well,
notes,
the only footnote I've got instead of people is souls, which is
that's the same thing. Yeah.
yeah. I bet it's just a
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Psychai, souls, or it's where we get the term
it's a
psychology
logical
from.
sense.
Yeah. Yep. So, sorry, one sec. Okay. Right. And they're all brought safely to land, right? So they all survive, which is exactly what God had told Paul would happen, so long as they all remained in the ship, and they did. And so the fact that all of these guys survived this is rather miraculous, given the context and the circumstance in which countless men have died in such previous circumstance upon the high seas.
And much fewer people.
Yes, sure. So now we cross over into 28, right? So that's the description of the shipwreck. And now we get this synopsis of their time on Malta, which, as verse 11 reveals, is 3 months ago. So through all the way through to the winter, right? Keeping in mind that we're in September, October when this is happening, and takes them all the way through the winter that they're there. So chapter 28, verse 1. And when they had been brought safely through to the shore, then we learned that the island was called Malta, right? Melita, as it's known in Greek, and historically Malta in English.
Greek, is it? Yeah, it
Yes,
says
Melita.
yeah.
Yes, Melita is its historic Greek name, from which we get the term Malta. And the natives, it uses the standard Greek terminology, Varvaroi, meaning barbarian. Barbarian was a term used by the Greeks for anyone who wasn't Greek. There's a whole host of different theories as to how that term came about, to my recollection. But this repetition of varvar, or barbar, if you want to say it in English, is a reference to them speaking a foreign language. Those who speak the foreign tongue, right? Those who don't speak Greek. So when it refers to the natives here, just at least touch on this. Malta's had a very long and interesting history. Malta has been occupied by many, many different peoples, and many different peoples have lived there. It was first settled thousands of years ago, primarily and first at least by the Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians were, so Phoenicia is the northern coast of the eastern Mediterranean. So what today is largely Lebanon, parts of far southern Turkey, northern Israel as well, right? But largely Lebanon. So this is famous city-states from there: Tyre, Sidon, Acca, a few places that are referenced in the Old Testament, such as where Jezebel was the princess of, etc. So the Phoenicians were a very thalassocratic people. Sounds like a complex word, but thalassa, meaning the sea. So they had a deep seafaring culture, really the most prominent seafaring culture of anyone in the ancient world. Famous civilizations like the Carthaginians, so Carthage, they were descendants of the Phoenicians and were a Phoenician people themselves. Carthage eventually came to rule the vast majority of the southern and western coastlands of the Mediterranean, centered around Carthage, of course, which then later fell to the Romans during the three Punic Wars. But nevertheless, the island has been occupied by and people who've lived there from the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians specifically as a descendant of them. The Romans as well then, of course. Malta is kind of situated, not literally directly, but as the crow flies, but broadly speaking, between Sicily and where Carthage is, right? Modern day Libya and Tunisia and whatnot. And so was then part of the Roman Empire. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it was then part of the Western Empire. When the last time that the Roman Empire was united was during the reign of Theodosius the Great, which we've touched on recently, even in church history classes. In 395 was the last time that the empire was united. It then, obviously we're talking centuries later from this point now, it's firmly under Roman control here, of course. But the Greeks themselves were the ones who had also, that's why you have this Hellenic influence as well. The Carthaginians, the Greeks, etc. It then eventually becomes part of the Western Empire, which then falls, and you have people who largely abandon the island, although there is a remnant there. It's eventually conquered by the Arab Muslims.
So all of Malta was abandoned, did you say?
Malta has been abandoned and reoccupied, abandoned, reoccupied multiple times over, many times.
Why would they abandon it? It looks quite fertile.
Yes, and part of it has to do with the ebb and flow of the defendability of the island. It has to do with it served. Malta is an extremely strategically advantageous place.
Quite contentious.
Yes, and so it's subject to geopolitical influences and warfare and other such things far more than many other places are. Right? Yeah.
The spot that you said where Paul landed, it's got all these salt water evaporation, ocean water evaporation ponds all along the coast there.
Right. Yeah.
And so it would have been salt harvesting, which would have been quite valuable.
Yes, there was known for that. Yes, and if that's the case, then that makes sense. That connection. But yes, nevertheless, the island is invaded and conquered by the Arab Muslims in 870 AD, and then eventually retaken by the Normans.
The Normans conquered it.
They did, yes. Not to be confused with Colin and Jenny.
They're
from
a
Churchill.
little bit outside their backyard at this point.
The Normans, well, no, the Normans, yeah, the Normans,
They're French.
yes, as in Normandy, yes. So the Normans really stepped onto the world stage in the 11th century, so the 1000s, right, or the 1000s. Of course, famously first with the Norman conquest of England under William the Conqueror in 1066. Just before that, they had moved in and become engaged in a 30-year campaign in the lead up to the First Crusade. So from about 1061 to 1091, of retaking Sicily. Okay, so Sicily had been conquered by the Abbasid Caliphate, by the Muslim Empire. And so. Sicily in those days was not just the island of Sicily; it was also Calabria, which is the southern portion of Italy. So basically, entire southern half of Italy.
Calabria is famous for other things these days.
Yes. Androgetta, the mafia. But nevertheless, yes. So they had So the Muslims had conquered basically the southern half of Italy and were Islamizing it quite rapidly. The Normans then move in to retake and reconquer that southern half of Italy and drive back out the Muslims and liberate the native Christian population there.
Was this at the time that Spain was also having that to and fro, Spain and Portugal, or was that?
Oh no, this is much later. No, the Spain Portuguese stuff that's 15th century, so centuries later. Yeah.
Right.
This is when a number of the Western Christian powers are starting to do something about the constant Islamic invasions of Europe. So the Normans, the Lombardians, the Burgundians, various other peoples, but in this case the Normans were heavy in that regard. So they spent about 30 years, 1061 to 1091, reconquering Sicily, and they do that successfully. And part of that is the conquest of the Norman conquest of Malta, to remove that as a strategic port for the North African Islamic
But then
powers.
after the Normans conquered it, when did the British get taken it
The British take that in 18. I want to say 18th. It was the early 1800s. I want to say 1813 for some reason rings a bell.
Diplomacy.
Yes, so that's that's part of the broader geopolitical power geopolitical game between the British Empire and the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean.
Well, they also do it in China as well. I feel like Hong Kong.
Yes, and they did. And they're also at that time playing against Russia in what's called the Great Game, which was influence over Central Asia. But anyway, the French eventually take Malta later on. But again, even all throughout these times, I'm talking about these great powers who have had Malta. The island, they've retreated. They've gone. There've been people who have lived there, people who have not lived there. Again, it's been abandoned and repopularized a number of times. So it's modern.
It's not a place to try and settle down from the sound of it.
Because of geopolitical and geostrategic influence, yeah, for sure. The French eventually take it, and then later on the British from the French. So that's why I say 1813. I'm fairly certain that the British came to power in Malta when they defeated Napoleon.
And Napoleon was then, of course, sent off to that island.
Exiled to St. Helena in the southern Atlantic, yeah. So the point being is that, yes, Malta these days, a very lovely place. Very historic. It's actually very beautiful. The island is just filled with all the various different ancient fortifications and streets and buildings that go all the way back to the medieval period. There's influences of course, heavily. There's Roman ruins there. There are, of course, Byzantine and Christian ruins there from the Normans, the Byzantines, etc. There's no doubt probably some Islamic Arab remnants there as well. As I mentioned, the French and the British are the last two to have held it. They then were granted independence from Britain, not all that long ago, I think maybe 20, 30 years ago, something like that. But yes, very interesting history. Not heavily populated. I think there's about, Ireland's got a population of a couple 100,000, somewhere out there, maybe 500,000 roughly. Maltese people.
We've got a fair few of them in Australia too.
Yeah,
Went to school quite a
About 200, I think about 200,000 or so. Yeah, the largest Maltese population outside of Malta is actually Australia.
Okay.
Mike Zarb, who was coming here for a while, he's Maltese.
I mean, you've got a decent airport and there's about 4
Yes.
or 5 big population centres.
Yeah, and very popular tourist place in the Mediterranean as well.
You see all the tourist photos on
Yeah.
the maps.
But no, very fascinating island. But it became an important strategic. A lot of what's there in terms of ruins and other historical buildings that still lived in are from the Crusader period. The Normans, having then liberated the island from the Arab Muslims, as they had done as kind of the final portion of liberating what would become the county of Sicily, so the southern half, which is a Norman kingdom then. That then many of those are then that's 1091.
Would there have been a big Templar presence there, considering it would have been
Not the Templars, another organisation. So eventually, exactly. So it becomes a major strategic port for then ships sailing to the Levant with regards to crusades, and it's part of the county of Sicily. Which was that Norman kingdom that was then established, after they reconquered it from the Muslims. And so eventually, yes, exactly. I know. It's just talking about Malta. Might as well spend X amount of time actually about the island and how it goes and flows forward, especially because this is the beginning of the Church of Malta. What happens here? So it influences and all that coming throughout. But yes, no, you're right. No, the island actually becomes the headquarters of not the Knights Templar, but the Knights Hospitaller, so the Knights of St. John, which was one of the other major...
I thought they were pretty much the same sort of thing, because the
no, they're two
Templars were supposed to be hospitality and sort of like bodyguard knights.
Yeah, so hospital. Yes, no, I understand. The Hospitaller in this context is actually talking about... so the order of the Knights of St. John was initially established as to defend and protect a hospital that was actually established in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land. And so then from that point, again, they were largely, none of the medieval chivalric orders, the Christian military orders of Europe, Western Europe, were just strictly there to fight. They all had something that was then kind of what defined their entire program or order. So, for example, I mentioned the Knights Hospitaller, right? The Knights of St. John. So the caring of the sick and medicine and funds for doctors and other such things like that was part of their service, because the medieval knights that were part of those chivalric orders were also, by definition, monks. Okay. So the warrior monk motif of the medieval period. And so they were not just simply fighters, they weren't just warriors, they were also monks, they were also deeply dedicated to acts of service and other such things. The Knights of St. Lazarus was an order that was established for those who had leprosy. And so they specifically cared, and again, in order to become part of the Knights of St. Lazarus, it was an order that was then an avenue by which men with leprosy, who obviously have had a very difficult life at that time, who are cut off from other kinds of avenues of work and other such things because of the desire to not spread leprosy, could then come among those who already had leprosy So they're not worried about having to,
Can't get it twice.
because they've already got it. And they were specifically tasked with helping those who had leprosy, right? The night,
Interesting they're named after Lazarus, Saint Lazarus. I wonder if,
the element of death.
or resurrection, perhaps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So part of the motif of why they were referred to that is this notion, obviously the story of Lazarus being brought back to life. It was this for these men who had leprosy, who either from birth or who had caught it, whatever it happened to be. This was like a second lease on life, right? They now had a purpose of defending and protecting. They also actually they're all very again, they're all skilled warriors. But again, what do they do in that scenario? If they're a skilled and trained warrior, they can't just be part of the army because they're now in camp and they're spreading leprosy. It just doesn't work. Or they go back and do what? They become a farmer, or they become a merchant. Now they're in a marketplace spreading. It just doesn't. Now they're spreading leprosy. Like there's no. All those things became cut off. But now they had something. Now they had a purpose. It was a brilliant idea. The Knights of St. Lazarus were fascinating. The Knights Templar were certainly probably the most prolific of any of the chivalric orders in terms of their talent.
And they accrued quite a bit of wealth too, just quite on the side.
Yes, and and of good way of doing it, the Knights Templar effectively invent basically the modern understanding of banking. So because they were the largest of any of the medieval chivalric orders, in terms of numbers of troops, tens of thousands at their height, they had many temples, in other words, castles or forts, all across Europe, all the way into the Levant, right, the Middle East. And because they were really kind of one of the very first. The Knights Hospitaller was actually the first. They were found in and the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, so the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem.
Yep.
That was the very first one. It was established to defend and protect that from any of the Islamic invaders from the Seljuk Empire or the Mamluks, etc. The Knights Templar were founded in 1119, and then the Hospitaller, I'd have to go back and look when they are. I think later on in the 12th century. But anyway, point being that yes, they had many. So the London Temple, which is in, for anyone who's been to London, there near the Courts of Inn. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Beautiful place. One of the most beautiful churches I've ever seen in my life. Very unique as well. Has a red tundra, but anyway, get off that. I could talk about that for a while. But yes, that's sort of the London Temple, the Paris Temple, etc. All over the place. And what you would do is, again, their primary mission was the defence and protection of Christians making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which was the entire impetus, not the singular, but one of the more influential impetuses for the Crusades in the first place was the fact that way too many Christians were just getting slaughtered by the Sultanate of Rum or by the Seljuk Empire, right, by the Muslims. So
that was the Templars' role, was to guard the temple, like
correct. So there's the bodyguard element, if you want to think of it that way, the close personal protection element, but a much broader mission set than that as well. The easiest way to defend and protect Christian pilgrims trying to journey their way to Jerusalem is to make sure that land is not under Islamic occupation. Right. So it's not just it's not just a bodyguard type of scenario. It's an actual. These are kind of effectively what amount to the medieval version of special forces, like we have today. But yes, because they had so many temples, they would then, if you were an Englishman coming from, say, London, and you were going all the way on a journey to Jerusalem, which those with the resources to do so did, you don't want to be, that trip is going to take months and is going to cost a pretty penny in resources, lodging, food, a ship, this and that.
You'd have to be a lord or mannered individual at least.
Or someone who's been invited along with that.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Like a sponsor.
Exactly. Like a local farmer's not just going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. No. That get cost. And so you would depart from London, but you don't want to carry all of the amount of the gold or silver or other such things, just currency that's going to cost you, right? Because you're asking to lose it, or you're asking to get robbed, or you're asking to have a shipwreck like this and have it fill it. So the Knights Templar came up essentially with that system, which was really for the first time, of deposit your money here, certainly at least in the medieval period, you deposit your money in the London temple where it's guarded and protected and no one would even dare to try and steal it. And I'm just going to use modern currency for the sake of the argument.
Checks, kind of.
Yeah, basically an IOU essentially.
It'd be an IOU, yeah.
50,000, I'm just going to use modern parlance, $50,000, right? And then you take that receipt essentially, you take that check with, and your next stop is say in Paris, and where they also have a temple there, right? And you go in and let's just say you need to take out $2,000 to pay for yourself in Paris, and they give you $2,000, and then you say you have 48,000 left, right? And and then your next stop is in Venice, right? Where you do it again and again. Do you know what I'm saying too? So that's that essential notion of banking.
So the British pound to this very day is still an IOU from the Bank of England for the equivalent amount of sterling. Which
Correct. Yeah, which is other equivalent. But yeah,
hence the currency is called sterling.
yes, exactly, and that's the historical influence there. Yes. So anyway, but no, Malta becomes the headquarters of the Knights of St. John. Okay, which is one of there's kind of 5 major orders, varying in size. But yeah, the Knights Templar, the Knights of St. John, the Teutonic Knights, so they were German knights.
Yep.
Who had...
You don't mess with the German knights.
No, the Teutonics were very powerful.
Michelle used to, where he grew up was on the Katoomba Wald, which is like,
yes,
it's all the
all right
along there, and there was
exactly
so many wars. We went to this one with, and you're going to have to excuse me because it was so interesting. It was the one where the saying, I think it's Varos.
Yes.
My legions.
My legions.
Well, yeah, because they ambushed them all. There's actually,
the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in...
Yeah. It's very hard to ambush a Roman legion.
And they got
that's
him
why
into
they
a
won.
funnel. They got him into a funnel. It was
Yeah,
incredible.
yeah.
And there's a big museum there now. You can.
Yeah, this is the story of Arminius and other such figures.
Yeah.
But the famous Battle of Teutoburg Forest in AD 9.
Yeah.
So earlier than we are here. Yeah, it was really the first
And they lost
major
the
loss. They lost the Aquila, which was the most devastating part. Yeah.
How many?
It was a.
They lost all of them. They lost 3 of them. All 3 legions.
But how many men is that in the Roman? Was it a whole legion's worth or
Multiple legions.
Multiple. Yeah,
legions?
no, it was
We're
it was
talking hundreds
huge.
of thousands then.
No. So a legion so a legion's about 5,500 troops, about 5,000 troops, 1 legion.
So
And
15,000.
they lost about 15 to 20,000. Yes.
But that's not including the wagon train that would have been.
Well, I suppose, yeah. No, they got routed heavily by the Germanians, and that was really the first major loss of the empire, and was really the most devastating loss in Roman imperial history. Yeah, for sure.
And it's not far where my husband grew
They would
up.
have lost a general or so as well.
They actually, one of the guys.
Varus ends up getting executed as a result of it. Yeah.
Wasn't he originally a Roman?
Arminius.
Yeah, there was.
Arminius himself was Germanic, and he was then raised under Varus, the Roman commander. I'm using the classical pronunciations. Varus.
Yeah.
Right? And was an officer in the Roman. But he then effectively defects back to his native Germanians or Germanians. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
It was an
inside
inside job.
strategy.
Yeah.
Effectively, yeah,
Wow.
very famous. Anyway, we've jumped around a lot, but the island of Malta was became the headquarters of the Knights of the Hospital of St. John. In other words, the Knights Hospitaller, and so yes, very influential, and was the headquarters for them and for their order for a long while. I'd have to look up specifically how long, obviously, but through heavy portions there of the Middle Ages, and Malta is inextricably linked to the order of.
Most people just know about the Knights Templar. They didn't know there were so many other hospitals.
No, the number ones, the Knights of St. John, the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights. Those are the 3 biggest, as well as then the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, which I have an ancestor of. The Knights of
very cool.
who was on the 3rd Crusade under Richard the Lionheart. And then the Knights of St. Lazarus. Yeah, those are the kind of the big 5, but certainly though, especially though the 4 most famous of them are those ones that I mentioned: the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic.
Became Masons afterwards.
Well, I kind of no. Well, yes-ish with an asterisk. The Masons kind of co-opted it. To give you the short version, so we can jump back into this.
Sorry.
No, it's perfect fine. Eventually the Knights, the Teutonic Knights, not quite. The Knights Templar become very powerful and influential. At this time, the king,
Worried the King of France, Charles,
Philip IV.
Philip IV.
And so then in 1314, I believe the year is off memory, or maybe a bit earlier, 1307. Anyway, beginning of
That's pretty late it's in modern times, essentially.
you're getting there. I mean, you're still in the high to late medieval period by that point. Yeah, the fall of Acre happens in 1291, which is the formal end of the kind of Crusader era, as we think of it, at least in the Levant. It's the last of the. That's when the Kingdom of Jerusalem falls in 1291, the fall of Acre. They lose there to the Mamluk Sultanate.
There's a good movie based on that one.
Yes, I believe so. And so then they now are this massively powerful organisation that the King of France doesn't quite like because they don't answer to him. They answer directly to Rome, and so he then essentially schemes a plot to discredit them and try them for heresy and.
Does midnight raids on all their temples and
Exactly.
steals everything.
Exactly. Steals their wealth and then gets them and plants a whole host of fake evidence of them worshipping pagan gods and doing magic rituals and other such things, which were then later shown to really probably not be true. And so then they have to reconstitute later in Portugal called the Order of Christ. Yes.
So they answered to the Pope, was it?
Yes, certainly the Knights Templar did. They answered directly to the Pope, which kept it out of, which was a good idea in fairness. It kept it out of the influence of national kings. It meant that because this was an international organisation across Christendom, that the King of England or the King of France or the Holy Roman Emperor or various other Christian rulers couldn't usurp the power of it and start controlling it for themselves.
It was a big
Keeping it-
mercenary army. If you had it, mate.
Keeping it under the papacy kept it internationally neutral, if that makes sense. And so that was a good way of going about it, of having them directly answer to him as opposed to one of the national Christian kings or rulers, and to stop any infighting, in that the French Templars and the English Templars are not at enmity with each other. They're part of the same brotherhood, right? It's that kind of idea. And so that was, until then, yes, Philip IV, I believe it was Philip IV at that time, yes, decided he didn't like the fact that they didn't owe him tax, and because that was part of the agreement, they didn't owe tax to anyone, because their money's going towards building schools, building hospitals, defending this. It's all, and he didn't quite like that, and he wanted their wealth, and he knew that they were wealthy and powerful, and he didn't control them, and he just wasn't that good of a man. But anyway.
Did they actually shoot off to Scotland though? When they went underground?
No, when they go underground, they then resurface about a century, across the course of the next century, through the 14th century, in Portugal. The King of Portugal at that time, I'd have to go back and look. It was either Pedro I or Alfonso IV. I can't remember. But nevertheless, the Portuguese king at that time takes them in. They reconstitute themselves as what would become known as the Order of Christ.
Okay. So the whole Mason thing's total bogus then?
It's not entirely bogus. There's still Templars the Templars are disbanded, at least on a formal level, everywhere else across Christendom, right, as a result of this. Mm-hmm. The Pope is the Pope who had been defending and protecting them against Philip IV is then succeeded by one who was, if I can put it politely,
Dodgy.
Probably in the back pocket of the French king. The French king at this point was the most powerful ruler in Christendom, and he exerted more power over the papacy than the papacy did over him. Right, and so the Pope then eventually condemns him for heresy on shockingly spurious evidence.
Oh dear.
This is only 200 years before the Reformation breaks out, by the way. So this is not meant to be. This is called being honest about history, because Christians can be honest about history, because it tends to be other religions who have to kind of whitewash the entire thing. But yes,
Like I said,
you've still got guys who were 5 minutes ago part of the Knights Templar who now magically are not, and are actually declared heretics, and so they have to.
Christianity would have gone under several times over just from the antics that had happened.
If it was dependent on the purity of the people who
Yeah.
constitute it, it would be screwed. Yeah,
Yep.
just well, everyone else would be too, but that's kind of the point. That's kind of the point of heretics. But yeah, so no, the connection of Freemasonry, which is largely, well, it's entirely an advent really of the Renaissance afterwards, and really not even just the Renaissance. You're talking centuries later. It's an 18th century project.
Right.
And the Scottish Rite, RIT, is what you're thinking of there. The adaptation of anything to do with the Templars is really just largely an ad hoc
It's a
theft.
Okay.
It's a borrowing
It's a
of.
fiction.
It's a borrowing of. No, there's no direct lineage of like
okay.
Knights Templar from, because you're talking. This is, I mean, it's nearly 400 years between those things. Actually, technically more than that. At the very beginning of the 1300s is when the Templars are disbanded. 1306, 1307, right around there, and it's not until the 18th century, so the 1700s, in which Freemasonry rises. Okay, as an organisation.
400, 500.
Yeah, correct. And so the only way of arguing that is that basically like there's this secret group of hereditary Templars who like just kept the thing going completely in secret and then popped up. But there's no evidence for that. So no, it's just largely an historical theft. Yeah,
No shortage of that.
indeed. Anyway, so that's our little excursion on the island of Malta.
Wow, little island, big history.
Little island, very big history, all kinds of famous. As I said, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans,
So
the Normans, the Arabs.
Is this day, well, it's been deserted several times. My question was, is there still a remnant of Phoenician population?
No. I mean, Maltese people these days are effectively, I mean, that ancestry really only traces back, at least as far as I'm aware, to that Norman period. Okay, so that late 11th century, so 1,000 years.
Who would have been the history of the people that welcomed Paul on the island? Would they have been Greek or would they have been?
That's a mixture of those groups. That for sure. This time here in the first century is that melting pot of Phoenician, Greek, and Roman.
Right.
Yep.
Because Phoenicians got quite a longer heritage than either Greek or Roman.
Yeah, much older.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. The thousands. Yeah, Malta has been. People have lived on Malta going back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. As you can see, on and off and on and off. At this time, yes. No, the people here at this time on Malta, that admixture of Phoenician, Greek, Roman, all hodgepodge together, I suppose, in succession. No, by the time you get to today's in the 21st century, no, none of that's there because that all gets abandoned.
Wow.
People evacuate the island. New people come to the island, etc., etc.
Wow.
It's a back and forth. It's like the Falkland Islands in many respects. The Falkland Islands down there, off, in the far South Atlantic.
But there's good reasons to get out of the Falkland Islands. It's a cold place.
Yes, but the Falkland Islands is much like that as well. The Falkland Islands is strategic when you have those like Francis Drake making his voyages and other such around what becomes the Drake Passage, the southern tip of South America. But it was back and forth. The Spanish occupied it, then they left, then the French came, then they left, then the British came, then they left, then the French came back, then the Spanish came back, then the English came back, and they decided to settle. That's basically what it is. The only people who haven't actually ever had it are the Argentinians.
Even though they reckon it's theirs.
Well, yeah, I mean, those days when that happens, the Falkland War, Argentina goes through a military junta, right? So in other words, a military coup and dictatorship in 1976, I believe that was. So by the time you get to 1980, that's just basically the Argentinians claiming it's theirs because it's a couple of hundred kilometres off their coast. Except that's not how territorial law works. The British rightfully owned that island because, like I'm saying, it was back and forth between them, the Spanish and the French, who all came and left like twice over. The British then returned and decided to settle there. That's a British island. It doesn't matter that's on the other side. It doesn't matter. That's a British island, not an Argentinian one. It doesn't matter how close it is to Argentina.
On the side of islands, I was watching this thing where this poor captain and his crew were sailing through the South Pacific.
Sure, yeah.
And they were trying to weather over on certain islands, island after island after island.
Yeah.
And they were all the non-existent islands that were on the world maps at that time that people had actually
Correct.
put
Yeah.
a fake island in there so they get some prestige for it.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, yeah, the island hopping across the South Pacific, you always actually exactly what we're talking about here, of slingshotting your way through the either the Straits of Magellan, which protects you a bit better, Tierra del Fuego, southern tip there. The Drake Passage is largely impassable even today. It's one of the most dangerous waters in all the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can island hop your way across the South Pacific.
Except that all the islands on his map just didn't exist.
No, yeah, it was largely that's where
running out of
that's where a
food
lot
or
of
what?
mystique. Yeah, exactly, and it was largely largely a gigantic ocean of mystery, and there's mysterious islands that may or may not be there, and
Even to this day, I mean, it was based on something that was just south of, I think Samoa, and basically on Google Earth, it's actually just blacked out because
yeah,
it's an island that was still on today's maps that doesn't exist, and it's a bit of a mistake of Cook or somebody that thought it was an island.
yeah, exactly, because they're kind of especially Cook, I mean, and others as well, but that are doing really a lot of that first exploring of many of those islands for the first time, or for the first time in a long time. The Polynesian islands again were occupied and abandoned as well, over and over again. So
It's just a bit of a side issue about that. To this day, they've still got islands that you think are there. And,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, the seas are the oceans of the world are a vast place. So anyway, now that we've talked about Malta, which has been fun, let's continue through. The rest of the passage actually kind of flows in a fairly straightforward, interesting fashion, but nevertheless, there's some context. But this is the foundation of Christianity in Malta, and so we'll see that now as it packs out. So let's just simply begin in verse 1 again for the sake of it. And when they had been brought safely through to shore, we then learned that the island was called Melita, or in English, as we said, Malta. And the natives showed us extraordinary affection, for because of the rain they had set in, because of the rain that had set in, and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks together and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat, as in the heat of the fire, and fastened itself on its hand. Right, so it bites him.
I've got a question about the viper.
Okay, we'll get back in a second.
Yep, no.
And when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began to say to one another, "Undoubtedly, this man is a murderer. And though he's been saved from the sea, justice, which we'll get back to after Paul's question, has not allowed him to live." So, what's your specific question on the viper?
Okay, so current search on vipers on Malta. All snakes currently present on Malta islands belong to family blah blah, and they're all non-poisonous.
They are these days, indeed. Yes, the current populace of snakes there in Malta is non-poisonous, which has led some, as they're reading this, to speculate that perhaps the reason why that there's not actually a miraculous event going on here, but rather it's a non-poisonous snake.
But
The
the locals knew whatever it was poisonous.
Correct, exactly, and so the word that gets used here, and I'll bring it up, is a common term, not just for, it gets applied to poisonous snakes or poisonous vipers. It's a generic term just meaning beasts or creatures. So that word there in verse 4, when the natives saw the creature hanging, I'll get
So it
the.
could be a spider or.
Well, no, it's definitely a viper. What I'm talking about is poisonous versus non-poisonous.
Okay.
Therion.
Could have just died out as well.
That's what I'm saying, yeah. Therion is a word that gets used ubiquitous all the time in ancient Greek literature to describe poisonous snakes. So there's no question here that, at least based on what's written, not only in the word that Luke uses, but also in the reaction of the people, this is definitely a poisonous snake.
In Germany, they used to have poisonous snakes, and now they've got a snake that has legs. It's technically another snake that is poisonous, but you've got to go basically up into some mountain range to find it. It's so rare now; it's almost extinct. So it's normal for them
that
used
happens
to
all the
have
time.
poisonous snakes.
So the
Ireland used to have snakes, and then St. Patrick drove them out.
Might have just killed out all the poisonous snakes, like all the wolves have been killed out. So.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that happens all the time. Again, the populations of Britain had wolves up until all 500 years ago. Not long at all.
And, did they have lions?
No, so they never did have lions.
Okay.
Amid much speculation, the lion motif across Europe is a direct kind of Christian symbolic connection to the notion of Christ as a lion, right? The Lion of Judah motif. And so, no, Europe. There's no evidence of lions having ever lived in Europe.
Were there lions in Judah?
In the Middle East, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, lions throughout the Middle East, absolutely. All kinds of wolves as well. And there's still wolves in plenty of parts of the Middle East as well, places like Turkey, elsewhere. And obviously wolves, there's no wolves in Britain these days, haven't been for about 500 years. But wolves were all over the British Isles until about 500 years ago. Bears as well, that's a bit earlier.
Recently put wolves back into Yellowstone because the deers were
In the
doing
US.
so much trouble.
Yeah, the Americans have had this fascinating thing, and I'll make it a short point.
Sure.
I could regale you about that for a while as well. Wolves. The Americans over the last kind of 50 or so years made the genius move to just simply get rid of a number of natural predators from certain environments without actually employing that thing in their headquarter brain and figuring out that when you do that, you end up disrupting the entire
Why would I need
hierarchy
a brain?
of
I've got a gun. I don't need a brain.
Yeah, well, I suppose, but it's largely been done on the impetus of it hasn't been like eradications. It's just been removing them from that environment, and we need to protect the native elk population. We need to protect the native white-tailed deer population. We need to protect the native, bighorn sheep population, etc., etc. Without understanding the fact that these natural predators in the hierarchy actually keep that in check, because then your elk population explodes, and then disease spreads, and then deformities occur, and now they're eating all the plants and they're overeating, and so it's almost like maybe God designed the thing to work as it was and doesn't really need to be fixed.
Same with sharks in the ocean. It's the same,
Yeah, there's a whole, and it always applies in all kinds of arenas as well. Yes, exactly. Look, the wolves in the lower 48 are largely endemic to Glacier National Park, which is up in Montana, a bit in north of Yellowstone, but and grizzly bears as well. But yes, no, there's never been lions in Britain, and that motif is symbolic. It's the same as across other parts of Europe as well.
Why they introduce wolves back into Britain?
If there was an ecological reason.
Well, it depends on how much deer damage they've got.
Correct. The thing is that in the UK, especially up in the borderlands, so northern England, southern Scotland, and obviously up into the Scottish Highlands, there's still a strong culture of hunting.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, pheasant.
All across the board, and so that culture also still then is a natural, and the way that's treated there is very historic, and it's very deeply tied into that culture of not just the Highlands but also the borderlands regions, Cambria and elsewhere.
In Australia, we've got such a huge deer vermin population problem.
Correct.
It's bigger than people even realise.
Exactly, yeah, and that's largely due to.
It's almost as bad as the pigs.
Yeah, it's largely due to. Well, there's 1,000 reasons, most of which can be accounted to government stupidity, but that's another issue altogether. Anyway, yes, now this is a poisonous viper, and we know this because because of the word that gets used.
Yeah.
Is the common term for poisonous snakes in Greek literature, and more importantly, the reaction is that every one of them react as if this guy's going to die. So it's very, very obvious this is a poisonous snake.
In one of two ways. Neither of them fun.
Touche. So he's just picked up a bundle of sticks, and inside that bundle of sticks is a snake. So it's a very Australian experience. So then in verse 4, when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, "Undoubtedly, this man is a murderer." Right, this guy's a criminal.
It's interesting. Paul just didn't freak out. He goes, "Oh, all right."
Essentially. And so then their response is, "Undoubtedly, this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice will not allow him to live." So they're making a reference to Justitia, which is the Roman goddess of justice, where we get the word justice from. And again, I mean, this crew is a hodgepodge, but this is the natives reacting here, who are largely Latinized, right? So they make reference to Justitia, so the Roman equivalent.
Is that the statue that indicates blindfolded with the scales in one hand?
Part of that's more modern adaptation. So Justitia, who is there's Justitia or Justitia in the classical, which is where we get the word justice from. Is the Roman goddess or the Roman personification of justice, her Greek equivalent has her Greek, which is obviously where this is adapted from. Her Greek equivalent. There are two goddesses associated with this: a mother and daughter. Themis, who's one of the Titans or Titaness in this case, is principally associated with that, and then her daughter, who she has with Zeus, Dike, D-I-K-E. Both of them are the foremost Greek goddesses associated with justice. The symbology, and it goes all the way back to ancient Egypt as well, and other such figures in the Egyptian pantheon. But the goddesses of justice across the various ancient pagan societies were pictured principally and foremost with scales in their hands.
Yeah, and a sword in the other hand, I think. Was it?
Yeah, the sword's a bit of a later one. The sword and the blindfold are largely motifs that come out of the Renaissance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cheers. It's interesting that it's a woman that's being depicted as the.
Well, the personifications of you have personal deities. So these are figures like Zeus and Hades and Poseidon or their Roman equivalents, right, etc. Jupiter elsewhere. Get you in one sec. You've then got others who are personifications of certain values or motifs, who are deities, but they're not. In the case, it's here is Hermes, right? Hermes. He's the god of blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
Whereas these are Artemis. Yeah.
Artemis.
Whereas they themselves are the god or goddess of X Y Z. Whereas this is the other kind of category of this is the goddess of da da da. Right? She's the personification of the thing. So it's like the other way around, and they're always in the feminine in that regard. You had a question, Nerida?
Oh, have you got the name of some sort of person here?
In verse 4,
Yeah,
Justitia, is that what yours?
doesn't mention.
Read out verse 4 for me.
When the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang
Yep.
on his hand, they said among themselves, no doubt this man is a murderer, who, though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live.
Vengeance, yeah. It's an English translation of this word Justitia, which is used. So vengeance it's referring to the goddess, yeah. And so vengeance, yeah, I mean vengeance is part of justice in that sense, with this notion of Lady Justice. And so yeah, so it's a vengeance, yeah. So justice, it's Justitia is the specific reference. In the Greek, as he's writing, he refers to the Greek equivalent, Dike. Okay. D-I-K.
This one's got the goddess justice.
It's all the same.
Justice with a capital J.
Yeah, that's all the above. Greek, in the Greek, Luke specifically refers to Dike, who is the Greek one that's being referred to, her Roman equivalent of Justitia or justice. And so yes, it's what they're essentially saying here to explain is that this guy's just survived a shipwreck and then he becomes the most, and then fate would have it that he gets bitten by a poisonous snake, by a viper. This guy must be a criminal. This guy must have done something wrong. There's no way that he escapes the wrath of Poseidon, all to then get bitten by and die at the hands of this poisonous snake. This is justice. This is Justitia, or as being referred to, Dike. That's probably who they're initially thinking of. They're Greek, right? The Greco-Roman, again, they're all equivalent. Dike is Justitia. It's the same thing. They're saying basically that no, he must be a criminal, and he must have somehow escaped or tricked his way out of facing whatever wrath that Poseidon or Neptune had for him.
They would have known that the centurions were looking after criminals anyway. So
that's my point. Yeah, correct. That's part of that. That's the criminal reference.
yeah.
And so basically, they're saying, this is the gods making sure that he didn't escape their punishment. Basically, their view is he somehow managed to escape this storm, and this whole shipwreck must have happened because of him. And Poseidon, or his Roman equivalent Neptune, must have brought about this, but he's managed to survive. So he survived the attempted death that Poseidon or Neptune were bringing upon him. But then the goddess Dike or Justitia has got him at last. that's basically the view.
Everybody stand back just in case Zeus steps in.
Yeah, or whoever. Yeah. Look, from a Greco-Roman perspective, this is a very natural reaction. This is the gods getting vengeance on him because he just managed to escape Poseidon / Neptune's wrath, and so another goddess, in this case another one of them, another deity stepped in to finish the job, kind of thing.
It's like there was a family coming up the giant stairway, and a rock dislodged and hit one of them. So while they were waiting for the ambulance to come down to treat the injury, they got struck by lightning as well while they were there.
Blimey. Yeah. Well, that's this kind of event that would
They
cause.
must have done something really good.
Yeah. Oh, that kind of. I mean, look. Yeah. The interplay of basically this is about fate.
I don't think they'll be coming back.
Probably not. I suppose. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the interplay of fate and whatnot, kind of working its way out here. And this is the mentality of. Yeah. This is the mentality of ancient paganism. This must be called. This action must be something having gone wrong. Like they're not counting the fact that the entire crew on board, 276 of them, just managed to survive this whole ordeal, which itself is wild. So you'd actually, but again, it's kind of, but that's also the notion as well. It's this. There's deeply ingrained within the notion, within especially Greco-Roman religious and cultural context, and it's not just them, it applies elsewhere, but it's really prevalent in some of their stories, is that mortals can escape the plans of the gods, and at times they do. There's no shortage of stories. I mean, again, the entire story is a story of Heracles, right? Or as the Romans knew him, Hercules, right? The entire story of Heracles.
Hercules and Pericles the same thing?
No, Heracles.
Heracles.
No, not Pericles. No, Pericles is the 5th century Athenian democratic leader. Heracles, which in Latin was then later known as Hercules. Yeah.
Okay.
Heracles, Heracles, Hera, the goddess Hera, the wife of Zeus. Kleos, glory, right? So the glory of Hera. Heracles, who was born of Zeus and not Hera, and so Hera curses the child. He actually has a famous interaction with vipers when he's a kid. Now that I think of it. Anyway, then the 12 labours of Heracles or Hercules. It was originally 10, but he then cheated on 2, so it became 12. Anyway, but anyway, he survives the 12 trials that Hera employs against. It's all against these famous creatures: the Linnaean Hydra, the Nemean lion, the adamantium boar, various blah blah.
It's a similar sort of thing like Jason and the Argonauts too.
Similar, yeah. It's this great quest or journey, yeah. But he escapes. All these labours were given by Hera to him in order to kill him, in order to finish him off, right, out of hatred and jealousy for him. And so he survived it. So there's this notion in the great Greco-Roman legends and myths that mortals, especially like the heroic mortals, especially the demigods, have this ability to like escape some particular plot or ploy that one of the gods or goddesses undertakes, right? And so it's this, which only serves really to further the problems with ancient paganism, in that the notion of like true universal sovereignty is not a concept at all in ancient paganism. Like the notion that exists in reality, the notion that exists in regards to Christianity of one omnipotent, universally sovereign God. That's not a concept at all. That's what I'm saying. The gods are all competing against each other. They're on the side of each other. They like this one more than they like this one, who likes that one more than that one, and humans are really just the playthings in the perpetual games that exist and plots that exist between the gods. So anyway, that's their natural reaction. This is a shockingly normal and standard reaction among any Greek or Roman people. So, in verse 5, however, he shakes off the viper, shakes off the creature into the fire and suffers no harm. Now again, this is actually a big point for us last week for those who were here. Is that as you're getting these historical details playing out, all the important symbolic truth that's also playing out in these real life stories is of vital importance as well. Again, we looked at that last week. But here again, the viper, the serpent, not harming him, the Apostle Paul, right, the Christian. It's poison, not actually poisoning him. And then him casting the serpent into the fire where it's destroyed. It's like all that motif is like so shockingly obvious when you read it in the light. But again, this is my point. So what happens is that it's the exact balance I pointed out last week, right? Of modern atheistic secular culture, we think of symbolism as being symbolic equals fake, or symbolic equals something that's not real. It's just whatever people conceptualize it to be. But symbolism conveys truth, it conveys meaning, it conveys purpose, right? And why this would be surprising here, it's just this very odd thing I've always noticed, is that when you come into the book of Acts, for whatever reason, at least in it's anecdotal, I know that, but in my experience, people tend to read these things without any of the symbolic meaning or value that gets ascribed to things in the Old Testament all the time.
They just take it as narrative without
without
the extra depth
the depth, that's a good way of putting it, the extra layer of depth. Yeah, exactly. See the story of the bronze serpent back in the book of Numbers, right, which we touched on even here on Good Friday, right, is an entirely narrative event. Like, that happened, and that text is written with no presumption of anything other than it's describing a historical story, right? But the symbolic value, the symbolic element of that story is just prolific, right? Which is exactly what those connections were we made on Good Friday, right? It's not an either or. It's actually a both and. And I'll explain what I mean by this in just a sec, but the theatrical element of the world, right, the theatrical nature of life, is something that is just evident throughout reading all of these things.
I must admit, before here, I took most of Acts as just being, narration.
So, because it is that. It's not that it's not that. I know what you mean. Yeah. It's that's what I'm saying. It's not an either or. It's a both and. Yeah.
Oh yeah, but you've showed the symbolic depth.
Oh right, yeah, sure.
Into it, and particularly like when he's being brought to trial in front of Felix and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
Even in front of the Sanhedrin at the time. It's just the duplication of Christ's actual treatment was not. I didn't perceive that.
Yeah, but that's what's playing out there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The trial of Paul in Jerusalem compared to and especially because it's occurring in, like, especially someone we've been talking about the Antonine Fortress. It's literally at the same place. Like, he's quite literally on the same steps where Jesus and Barabbas were. Like, it's the same place. And so you're getting this replayed again. Yeah, exactly. But see, all of that. But that's what happens. See, the options either become, if one steps away from that or one abandons that, is you either end up with two extremes. You either, one, become really Gnostic, which is where none of these stories actually happened in material history. They're all just purely spiritual, symbolic myths in the sense that we use myths today, or the opposite end of that spectrum is a entirely basically atheistic materialist reading where all of it is just purely historical data with no broader teleological meaning at all.
Until you ask the question, well, why did the writer bother to put this little incident about the snake in here?
Yeah, right.
I mean, it was just a snake. How many times has he actually had those sort of issues?
Or whatever, Yep, and you could just basically exactly, and you can just render it down to, Luke was a doctor, he was a physician, and so he found this medically interesting. Like, you can just turn it into a completely colourless vanilla thing, or you can actually see.
He put it for a reason.
Yeah, the symbolic value and weight to it. Yeah, is that in reality, the material and the spiritual are not in competition with each other. They're actually in consort. And so these are for real historical events. Right? I'm saying to you, so it's not that oh no, this is an act of like mythopoeia, right? Myth creation. Right? An act of mythopoeia, myth creation, right? It's not just purely stories to give inspiration or some. No. This did really happen, and it has deep symbolic depth and value to it. Yeah.
A snake thrown into the fire, that's Satan into hell.
Yeah, the serpent, which is the most classic motif of evil that's ever existed, even across cultures, but especially in the biblical cultural context, in Christianity, that is. The serpent attacking him, yet him not being affected by its poison, and then him actually turning around, controlling and gaining dominion and casting it. It's actually very much playing in, and it's a genius move. The whole point about that theatrical element that I was mentioning, right, is that see, that's, you get echoes of that in stories. Every one of these would have been familiar. I mentioned earlier Heracles handling the very first attack, or the very first thing that Hera sends against Heracles are vipers.
Oh, right.
As a child, yes.
Okay.
Because he's a demigod, he's the son of Zeus, right, and a mortal mother. She then, she sends the vipers. He then actually ends up controlling them, and they don't affect him and bite him. You get stories of Apollo as well, who has interactions with vipers. I mean, one of the most famous things we've covered, even when we've talked about it before, the Oracle of Delphi. It's kind of in church history classes. It's kind of in here as well. When we're moving through Greece earlier, the founding of that temple there, the temple of Apollo, is when Apollo slays the great serpent monster Python or Python. Okay, like we encountered when we were going through this, we encountered the Pythoness, right? The Pythia, one of the priestesses of Apollo, up in where we were, I think we're in Philippi. This young girl who was doing divination and whatever, and then Paul exorcises her, and she can no longer tell fortunes and all that jazz.
Yeah.
She's a prophetess or a priestess of Apollo from Delphi, and that whole story is him slaying the great serpent Python. So there's these echoes in ancient pagan legend and story that really actually is taking things and elements that are true. They've been twisted and contorted through idolization, as in like idolatry and false worship. But there's the echoes of truth that are then preparing the world almost for the advent of the true one, right, Christ. And then you then have this come through and follow here. That's why. Oh, go ahead.
And there's no sort of like, oh yeah, the snake didn't really bite him that bad. He probably didn't get envenomated.
Yeah, it didn't employ.
Off his arm.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, no, I'm saying there's no question here. They know these full well. Yeah, exactly. And when I'm talking about these various pagan whispers or shadows of these kinds of motifs that play their way through, that are actually really giving insight or window into the actual truth of God and the world and everything in between, is that I'm not just making it up the top of my head. Verse 6 tells you exactly what I'm saying. Okay?
Oh, yeah. I forget that.
They were waiting for him to soon swell up and suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, so he's fine, changing their minds, they began to say that he was a god. Okay, this is exactly what I'm talking about, right? So
He conquered the snake as he. Yep.
It's just like the story. It's very, very similar. Again, I'm saying shadows and whispers. That's what I mean. Right? That's why I use that terminology. Many Christians debate this point as well, by the way. Many in the early church made this point. In fact, this is a very common point that the early Christian theologians and bishops and stuff made. That, especially for them, because they're all Greek, they're talking about, in their context, again, that many of the Greek stories are giving these kinds of veiled light to the Greeks to prepare them for the coming of the Christ, right, of the true God. who then defeats all the false gods and blah, blah, blah. They talk about that all the time. It's talked about in the medieval period. It's talked about even more modern figures like C.S. Lewis actually go very much in depth on this subject. And that this kind of verse is exactly what I'm talking about. They think he's a god because this brings to memory a number of stories. Like I mentioned, Heracles when he's a child, it brings to mind certain stories with regards to Apollo, who's one of the most in-depth, one of the deepest and most significant deities in all of the ancient world. Very, very complex and significant. And so they have this. This is not the first time that Paul's been mistaken for a god either. It happened up in, I think it was Derbe or Lystra, where when he was with Barnabas, they thought him to be Hermes or Hermes, the messenger god, and Barnabas as Zeus, right? Because they have this motif of the gods secretly appearing to us, right? That's a lot of what those stories are, right? So I'm not just making it up. I'm saying to you, these echoes and these shadows, these whispers throughout ancient pagan religion and legend are all kind of weaving their way forward with elements and kernels of truth that then come to fruition. Right? That's why every single major civilization that's ever been has had a very important story about a great ancient flood before their time having occurred. And there's always at least a man who builds a giant boat, giant ship, and then survives this great flood and then brings truth back into the world. Like there's always this motif. Certain cultures literally have it as 8, which is exactly the biblical story. That's not a necessary part, right? I'm saying to you, the elements of truth then get.
The amount of people survive being 8.
Yeah, there are other cultures who have it where it's 8. The ancient Chinese equivalent, the ancient Chinese legends of this great flood have 8 people.
So, okay. Oh, because if it was just a Mediterranean issue,
No,
it
it's
wouldn't
not.
have gotten to China.
No.
You have to, no, I can't ask Dad anymore. He's going to say, I'll have to ask Dad if the Asaras had any legends like that.
Zongo, yeah. It's all over the place. The Mesoamericans, again, when the Spanish arrive in Mesoamerica, when they conquer the Aztec Empire,
They had the same thing.
1519 to 1521, they then realize they have the same legend of a great flood occurring, and then this heroic figure from the west who sails across Quetzalcoatl, and who's this great seafaring figure and teaches them culture and teaches them this and blah blah. You get all these words as way of that.
Some people have said that the animals that they took on the ark were only the domestics, cows, sheep.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the scriptures don't go into detail about what are the kinds. It just says that there's
the people who like the rubbish
kinds.
account. There's no way you could have got 2 of every animal in the world.
Yeah, and again, and that's why it's
The sea creatures, what happens to them?
right. Elements of those will survive, elements not. That's what I'm saying to you. It's a question of then. That's why it's important to keep things in balance. Obviously, there's plenty of there's a 1,000 worthwhile discussions that can be had on any subject.
Oh, yeah.
Part of it has to be the balance of not reading, not underreading. You don't want to underread, right? So when the scriptures say X, Y, and Z, you don't want to water it down or downplay it, but you also don't want to do the error on the other side, which is over-reading something, because you can very quickly enter the realm of speculation. And there's plenty of value in having speculative discussions, as long as everyone actually remembers that it's entirely speculative discussions. It's when people forget the distinction between speculation and like hard data, as in clear information, they then confuse their opinion for a doctrine. That's the difference. So yeah. So what kinds of animals? It's we're not told. It doesn't really matter. But you had to.
In a lot of our literature and movies and stuff, there's one hero, a chosen one, who's a nobody who goes up against this great evil.
Yeah, there's plenty of motifs like that. Yeah.
And has that been introduced by Christianity? Or is it
Specifically, the kind of underdog figure who then.
Harry Potter.
I suppose, yeah. Well,
Guess what we're watching at the moment?
he's I mean, it's kind of
Snake.
The emphasis on that's a brilliant question, very in-depth one as well. different civilizations have placed value on, at least specifically the construct of the hero, differently depending on a variety of factors. In our time, and I'm going to answer it this way and then retroactively fill it back in. In our time, the emphasis tends, especially in the era of like film and cinema kind of thing, the emphasis tends to be on individual, run-of-the-mill Joe Schmo who has nothing inherently heroic about him per se, who has, like, there's no particular endemic or inherent special quality, and then something happens to him that then changes the trajectory of his life or calls him to a higher purpose or whatever it is. There can certainly be value in that. I don't think there's I think we do it in a very bad way. Basically, the ones that are happening is that it's the average run-of-the-mill person who has nothing inherently chosen about them, if you want to think of it that way. So what it does is it allows us to think of ourselves in that position. But the way that they become a hero is because of just entirely exogenous, in other words, foreign things that happen. Like the worst example of this is something like Spider-Man, who's just literally, and it's not even, there's not a problem with him being a nothing and a nobody. That's just, he's just like everyone. He's like me. He's like anyone else. He's just a run-of-the-mill Joe Schmo, in this case, teenager from New York, who gets bitten by a radioactive spider, essentially. So, like, there's nothing actually inherently heroic about him per se. He's just the subject of basically what amounts to a fluke.
Now that you're a superhero, you've got to be heroic. And
now that this completely and utterly random twist of fate that's so wild-eyed in the first place, right? Radioactive spider, the blah blah blah. You know what I'm saying? There's no inherent, and all of them like that. I'm thinking of basically the entire Captain America. Exactly, Captain America is just a super soldier science experiment. Any other moral virtue beyond? I mean, there is a bit of a difference to him. He has some character element, I suppose, but that's a real problem. I've actually talked about this before, even at seminary. Yeah,
also,
I hate it. But
the hero's got to be worse than the villain, right? Got to be.
I'm thinking about the concept of a saviour for a world.
Yes, exactly. And so there's this notion of this is exactly the point that's being drawn to, is that there is this notion, because it's almost the same problem that occurs, which is kind of what you tell you. It's the same problem that occurs in, especially the Greek and the Roman legends, right? Those legends and myths. What's really occurring there is the reason why, at the end of the day, like if you take the great stable of heroes, heroes is an actual category in Greco-Roman legend, right? It's where we get the English word hero from, okay? From hero, right? Which is what these figures are, like Achilles and Heracles and Perseus and Theseus and other such figures. Virtually all of them, have these great epic quests and other such things, and slay these monsters or battle against this god and survive this trial and whatever, blah, blah, blah. Because at the end of the day, they're demigods. One of their parents is divine. Their father's Zeus, their mother is such and such. So they're actually just not. They're not just like every single other. The thing that gets them over the line is the fact that actually they're half a god. They're a half god. They're a demigod. That's what that means, right?
Special powers.
Right. Now, there's some respectability in that, I suppose, because the inherent notion of the heroic figure actually having something that actually defines him as heroic, that's actually I would argue, a good motive. But what's being drawn in this sense is that, in the Christian conceptualization of this same motif, I'm saying this is universal across human cultures. The Christian conceptualization is on that good side, because I'm actually arguing that there is an element of goodness to that, in that there is something that actually distinguishes the hero apart, unlike a Spider-Man who's just, there's nothing that distinguishes him. He's just normal, and then something completely out of his control happens, and now he's distinct. That's what I don't like. There's something being inherent to that individual from birth that can be respected. Oh, he's a prince. Oh, he's a this, whatever happens to be, right? That makes sense. With Christ, it's exactly like that. It's not, he doesn't become a god later on, so he doesn't undergo what would be called an apotheosis, right, an elevation to become a god, like what Hercules eventually goes through. He doesn't do something that then makes him worthy of becoming a god. Like, no, he actually always just was. So there is something that inherently sets him distinct and apart. The difference is on the Christian side, which I find beautiful, is that it's almost like a hybridization. I think it's a hybridization of, well, of course Achilles is the greatest warrior in the world because his mother's divine and his father's a king. So obviously, right? There's that. So the inherent thing of basically, well, the fact you're a demigod, what actually gets you along. And then the other end is Spider-Man, this example. The actually nothing inherently heroic about you, but something completely random and arbitrary happens, and then all of a sudden now, ta-da. The balance, the hybridized balance between that, which I think is what's perfect. It's also what I think lends to being Christianity true as well. Christ is inherently divine. He is inherently God. So I'm saying the inherent issue isn't actually the core of it. For then the Christian, through the gospel, through the transformation of our heart, of our soul, right, through being born again, right, the recreation, we then become something that's distinct, but not as a result of ourselves. It is a result of something external. Okay, so I'm saying to you, it's not just you've got elements that are not wrong in themselves. It's how they then play themselves out. Is that then, because of then being in the service of that one who has always been God and is also man, that we then now are raised up in that heroic kind of vein that he has, if that makes any sense. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's this hybrid between the two problems of the opposite ends of this story motif or the heroic motif. And that can go, again, any of those things can be twisted into things that just don't work. But yeah, the Christian hybridization of that heroic concept is it's not purely through, oh, you're born a such and such. It's also not through, oh, some arbitrary thing happened to you. And it's also not just purely through you underwent some great trial. Because the problem with you just went, you were a nobody and a nothing, and then you completed some great task, and now you're a hero. There's no explanation for how on earth or why you somehow managed to complete this great quest. What's within you, right?
Well, it's not even ours. It's like the faith is something that's given to us. It's not our faith.
Yep.
And the actual transformation, the Holy Spirit and its transformation,
yep,
is also given to us.
That's my yep.
Yeah. So it's actually an act of divine grace within each and every Christian.
Oh, correct. That's my point.
Yeah.
And so this motif plays out. The most perfect iteration of this in history is the Lord of the Rings. Okay, is Tolkien, which is touching exactly on this. Is that so? The central heroes of this being the hobbits themselves, right? As they plod their way along and eventually destroy the ring and whatever Mount Doom, etc. That entire ordeal that they undergo. With Frodo and Samwise Gamgee making this great quest, even though, again, in themselves, they're short, they're shy, they're timid, they're afraid, they just want to live peacefully in the Shire.
The least of humanity. Yeah,
the least of any of everyone exactly. They're not inherently violent and powerful creatures like the orcs. They're not inherently brave and virtuous and morally strong like the race of men are, right? There's nothing inherent in them. However, right, it doesn't play out like a Spider-Man thing. Is that they don't just have some magic. It's not like Gandalf casts some magic spell and all of a sudden they turn to super soldiers. That would be the Spider-Man equivalent.
And it even shows that Gandalf himself recognises that he doesn't have the power to accomplish this.
Correct. Exactly? None of them do in isolation, right? Yeah. So you get this interplay between various figures that then is what allows them to actually triumph and accomplish. They do it through the recognition of a calling to a higher purpose, which is that the Shire needs to take the fight to Mordor, not the other way around. Because if the Shire just stays in the Shire, then the Shire is not going to be the Shire for very long.
Which is what happened when they returned. So
yeah, true, exactly. But that's another point. Okay, but yes, correct. Is that sitting around in the Shire is a perfect way to guarantee that the Shire will eventually not be the Shire, because Mordor's coming to the Shire whether the Shire wants it to or not. And so you actually have to go out and take the fight to the enemy, not sit around and wait and just hope that it doesn't happen, because that doesn't work. They triumph through something that actually is inherent to them. See, amidst all of the comparisons, because again, the hobbits in that whole world are, and it's a fair point, are the smallest, the tiniest, the weakest. And that's true. But they actually do have something inherent to them. That's the distinction, right?
And them travelling is what they don't like to do. They don't like.
Oh, yeah, that's what I'm saying to you. Yeah. They're doing all the things they don't like. They don't like to travel out. Yeah. They like to stay in the comfort and the tranquility of the Shire, blah, blah, blah. But what they do have inherent in them is the love of the Shire.
Yeah.
Right? And a commitment of character, not just some exogenous, like actually it's part of who they are, of doing the right thing. Right? So so in other words, they have a value commitment. They have an epistemological commitment to truth and goodness that then is wrapped in love of the Shire.
There's a grayscale that's just shown there as well.
Sure, exactly,
like
yeah.
There's stuff that's
all of
stolen out of
100%. Yeah. So all of that is actually inherent to them. So there is something inherent to the.
Is that like, I always think like Moses, I've got a whole new respect for Moses. You know, I mean, I always kind of thought he was pretty cool, but
Sure.
this idea that he did not want this task that was put upon him.
Well, Moses is just one more of exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So Moses did have, so this is my whole point, there has to be something inherent, there has to be something heroic. Otherwise it's just a completely arbitrary, meaningless ultimately story like a Spider-Man. And there's not, I know I keep saying him, but he's just Moses.
It's even
That's the archetype.
worse for Moses because he knows what he was up against. He was raised in
Exactly. See, all those play in, but at the end of the
his
day,
eyes are wide
100%.
open.
Yeah, I know,
This is
that's
gonna
why
be
he was...
nasty.
But this is exactly my point. See, there is something inherent with Moses. He is a Hebrew who's a prince of Egypt. Okay? It's not even faintly coincidental that the guy who's the leader is the one guy ever who's a Hebrew and a prince of Egypt.
Yeah.
And he chose none of that. That's what I'm saying to you. None of that's chosen. He doesn't choose to be Hebrew. He's born a Hebrew. He doesn't choose to be a prince of Egypt. He's raised that way. He's effectively...
And he certainly didn't
He's born a
choose
prince
to
of
be a
Egypt.
leader of people.
That's my point. But this is my point about the hero motif, is there actually has to be something inherently heroic. Otherwise, this is my point about why I hate the modern hero films almost entirely, is that it's really actually just an act of self-aggrandizement on modern Western man's part, is that you take a Spider-Man or various other figures that are just like that. But even that plays out. So I'm thinking, again, I'm going all down the road. Spider-Man's this end, Superman's this end.
Yes.
Superman is like the Achilles or the Hercules. He's just an alien.
Yeah.
Right? So Superman, again, forget the red, white and blue, forget the rah-rah America, forget the born and raised on corn in Kansas motif. No, he's just an alien. It doesn't matter that he looks like, that's the whole, it's rubbish. There's nothing even faintly inspiring about a Superman figure because he's just an alien from Krypton, right? Who has superpowers because he's an alien, right? That's the whole story. There's nothing human about him. So that's literally the examples of what I'm talking about.
And
where
in essence for him,
innate sort of consciousness that we need something more powerful than us to save us.
yes,
And that's what super...
like that always plays out in the heroic.
and
In the
his
heroic
power
archetype, you're right,
comes from
yeah.
our son, not from his innateness.
Exactly, that's my whole
powers.
point. Exactly, and so these things are and so what ends up happening is we either fall into that era or we fall into the nothing inherently. It's just a Joe Schmo, but then something happens to him. But that's not you. We're doing it to go, oh, we can become heroes too. No, but not really, because all these guys just become heroes through utter flukes. They're just random. They fall in a vat of nuclear waste, or they have some this and that, and they get bitten by a radioactive spider.
The two exceptions are Iron Man and Batman.
Yes, they are the two exceptions. Yeah, one on the Marvel side, one on the DC side. Yes, you're right. No, those are two exceptions.
Where Batman, by his wealth and smarts, has become,
That's the inherent thing, and that I have no problem with.
and then Iron Man.
Batman's issue is
smarts.
the not killing people, but that's only done because of he initially did, but then in the 1950s, it's after World War II, people are kind of a little bit sick of death, and so then they changed the story. But that's not an issue. Yeah. But no, look, this hero archetype is extremely important. Yeah, and Moses is a classic example, seeing as Lisa mentions it, of exactly this. There is actually something inherent. So there's something that sets Moses apart from everyone else, right? That's the hero archetype. And there has to be that. It can't be only that, but there has to.
Well, he's flawed as well. That's the other thing. He's
Yep.
very human. He's not.
So that's what I'm saying to you. Yeah, it's not just exactly. There has to be something inherent to the hero. Otherwise, everyone's a hero, which means that no one's a hero.
And he wasn't walking into that just oblivious. He knew
No.
exactly.
No, exactly. That's. I mean,
exactly what
he spends
Yeah.
40 years of his life.
He's
over
one
in
I'm going to
Midian.
be chatting to when I get up.
Yeah. Right. There has
I've
to
got a long
be.
list.
There's always the chosen element. Again, Josh, the heroic figure of Joshua is this great warrior king figure, right? He's not literally crown king, but it's a warrior king
Paul is the
motif.
one I want to have a long talk to.
Sure, yeah, exactly. We'll have plenty of time. All these various figures. Again, Joshua is chosen, right? Same with David. Again, David's coming from the right bloodline. And he's chosen by God. He's anointed king in that. So, like all of these things are, there has to be. Whereas for us today, we've largely lost and abandoned that through. Again, I know I keep always saying it, this is what it is. It's largely our Enlightenment era principles. It's a very democratic way of treating these stories, actually, in fact. It's a democratization of it. We're all on the equal level playing field, and that's what I'm saying to you. When everyone's a hero, no one's a hero. There's nothing that distinguishes the hero anymore. When everyone's a hero, no one's a hero. When everyone can just become a hero, then actually really effectively we end up at the same point. No one's a hero.
These days, when we've got someone who thinks they're special and above everybody else, you get your serial killers, you get your...
Yes, exactly. When it's
We're breeding narcissists. It's just
That's
it's
what-
the
but
whole world. We're drowning.
the
in
confluence,
narcissists.
you're both 100% correct, but the reason why is because we've lost this motif, because we've abandoned this concept in our culture. So then those who in times past had something like that, they had avenues for actually living that out in life, where if you don't have that, the only ways to live that out today are either to become famous for God knows what reason, to become a celebrity for insert whatever the heck, and really what that is actually just become rich. That's largely what that becomes.
Very difficult for a person who's actually stood in front of the throne of God and actually had to, face his greatness to be narcissistic, and I find that the Holy Spirit, which does that to us, tends to subdue our narcissism quite
Correct, and that's where I mean, look, the kind of chivalric, heroic ideal of the medieval knight had very much had that. It lost a bit of its balance toward the late medieval period through Romanticism, which is another issue altogether. But certainly during the what is in my view the golden age of it, like the high medieval period, kind of like when we're talking about the Crusades. There was something heroic about, like we were talking about earlier with the Knights Templar, there was something heroic about them. Many of them, again, knights by definition are nobility, right? They're noble, they're lords, right? They're in the service of a higher ranking nobleman, right? A baron of some kind, right? A marquis, an earl, etc., or even a duke or a king. But there is something inherent to them, right? They're nobility. They're not just Bob the farmer from down the road and across the way. But they're also seconded to a higher purpose, right? A mission of some kind, a goal of some kind. There's a higher inherent purpose. And all of that was, again, I have theological problems with monasticism, but at least on the pragmatic side, the fact that they're warrior monks is exactly what I'm talking about. Is that any notion of pride or vainglory was very quickly and easily tempered through their commitment in the monastic religious life, right? The prayers, the constant works of good service, etc., as part of that brotherhood, whichever one you're talking about, the Teutonic, Hospitaller, Templar, etc. And so humility was at the utter essence. The motto of the Knights Templar, non nobis domine, non nobis, not for our name, Lord, right? Et tua de gloriam, I think was the rest of it. I have to go back and have a look. But long story short, in English, I butchered it in Latin, but in English, not for our sake, Lord, not for our sake, but for thy glory, right? For the glory of your name, right? So it was entirely this motif, and their full name was the poor fellow soldiers of the Temple of Christ, and their image, their logo, if you're thinking of that, was two knights on the one horse, which is very odd. But the whole symbolism was that part of that they took vows of poverty. They didn't, everything they had would go communally into the temple order, right?
Which is what communism tried to steal away from that.
Yeah, exactly. Because on that localized order level of a bunch of guys in a brotherhood were all on the same page, that works. The extrapolation of that through Marx was the perversion of that concept, the utter perversion. Yeah, right. And so the two knights on the one horse is that they can only afford the one horse, right? So it's this element of, so it's there's something heroic in them. There's something that sets them apart. They're all noblemen, right? They're nobility, but they're called to a higher purpose. So it's the mission aspect, and then it's entirely wrapped up and disciplined and tempered with all of the, what we call the not there was a literal list of this, right? But what we tend to think of as the chivalric code, right? These virtues, okay? Especially what are called the Christian virtues of the four cardinal virtues and the three theological virtues or Christian virtues. So wisdom, prudence, justice, and temperance, which are taken from ancient Greco-Roman sources, and then the three theological virtues: faith, hope, love, from 1 Corinthians, right? So that combination, the seven, of course, the symbolic value of seven, right, served as really the core of chivalric virtue, and not just for them, for Christians all throughout the medieval period. But that's solution. Yeah.
These days we use the term chivalrous or chivalry without even understanding what you just explained.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Exactly. I mean, in a strict sense, I mean, it comes from the French term chevalier, which meant a knight, a horseman, right? A mounted warrior, right? It's where we get the word cavalry from. It's the same root. And so, yeah, so it had to do such a chivalric, it had to do the knightly virtues, or the virtues or character of a knight. Again, that adapted and shifted and was really a work of French and English culture particularly. But these kinds of things, that's the heroic motif playing out in its most ideal form. Yeah. Very interesting discussion. I wasn't expecting to go into that. Let me finish these last couple of verses. They all lay out very straightforward, right? Just 7 through 10. Now, in the areas around that place were lands belonging to the leading men of the island, to the leading man of the island named Publius, very common Roman name, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius was lying afflicted with fever and dysentery, which was effectively a death sentence, especially the dysentery. And Paul, fever you could survive, dysentery, almost certainly not. And Paul, going to see him and having prayed, laid his hands upon him and healed him. We've seen this before as well. Again, it's as an apostle, the gift of healing. But also should be understood again, he's not generating the healing within himself. This is a gift from God, right? He heals because really what's actually occurring is the Holy Spirit is healing through him. We've pointed this out before. I don't want to go into depth of it again. These gifts are given at specific and varied times throughout. Again, the same reason that these are during the apostolic era they possessed this by the grace of God was for the same reason that Christ himself, right, to demonstrate the truth and the power of the gospel as it's now going forth for the first time into the world, etc., etc.
The authority of
the authority, yeah, it's all about authority, correct? Yes, exactly right. And the healing nature of the gospel, right? So the physical healing really pointing to the need for the deeper spiritual healing. That's all that's about, right? And then verse 9, and after this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and were also being healed. And they also bestowed upon us many honours of respect. And when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all that we needed.
That's pretty generous. But then again,
again, they look at, this is my whole point about how these things serve these symbolic purposes. They've seen this happen. They've seen him survive a snake bite that no doubt many of themselves had seen people at whatever rate being bitten and die. They've seen that before, right? They've seen,
like in verse 6, they actually are standing there waiting for him to swell up and suddenly fall down
not
dead. So they've seen it, obviously.
I'm saying they know exactly what's going to happen, as blood coagulates and whatever else happens, right? Blah, blah, blah. And so they're waiting for that to happen.
The anaphylactic reaction.
Exactly. And it doesn't happen. And so, again, but then, and once it doesn't say it, he doesn't need to, obviously, like he did back in, well, it was Derbe, right, or Lystra it was. Him explaining to them, no, I'm not God. but let me tell you about the one who is. And he's there with them for 3 months, as verse 11 indicates. And again, this is, people converting, this is the foundation of the church. God very graciously physically heals many ills to point toward the need for the spiritual healing, and then subsequently they're spiritually healed. Again, all of that's it. It doesn't spell into detail that, but this is the same. We've already seen this thing happen over and over again, right, before, throughout the book of Acts. And the physical healing is not the end in and of itself. It's for a purpose to point toward the spiritual healing. When people get obsessed in certain denominations today with physical healing, they're entirely missing the point, and really making an idol out of it. Which the scriptures also warn against, because ad infinitum they warn against seeking these kinds of miraculous signs and wonders, because all you do is fall into superstition and other such problems. And so they bestowed upon us many honours of respect. They received them well. The church is then founded there, and Christianity comes to Malta.
Well, there's two things working towards it. Lots of people are coming to Paul to be cured. So he's a small island, big reputation, and he's there for 3 months to actually tell them about them.
Yep, exactly.
The good news, the gospel.
Yeah, 100%.
What a way to start a church, eh? Captive audience.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, well, literally and figuratively.
Yeah, literally on their little island.
Yes.
Something bothering me, I don't know if I'm imagining this, but
Oh, go ahead.
a lot of non-Christians point to the Crusades as evidence that the Christians are these terrible.
Yeah, sure. I know. Yeah. No, you're right. That's a very, very accurate observation, but it's a very modern interpretation. Yeah, I mean, the Crusades, as far as most, certainly at least on the academic level, secular historians are concerned, is that the Crusades are basically one of, if not the worst things that ever happened in human history. But it really just comes down to nothing more than rather thinly veiled anti-Christian bias, essentially. I've explained this in other contexts, but even just a short synopsis. People who think that the Crusades, I mean, talking about just in general, like people who have a vague idea that the Crusades were this great moral atrocity, when pressed as to when the first Crusade even began, wouldn't be able to tell you. It's a reality. It's a deep ignorance of the Crusades. The Crusades, the first Crusade, which is from 1095 to 1099, so the tail end of the 11th century, is coming on the back end of well over 300 years, actually more than that, 400 years of constant on and off Islamic invasions of Europe.
And the Islams used to convert by the sword. They totally ignored
This is
that.
during the time, this is during the time when Islam heavily converted by the sword. Not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. And so, I mean, you have the at the time, what was the Rashidun Caliphate, crosses over the Straits of Gibraltar in the early 700s, 711, when they invade the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal. They barnstorm their way through that. They conquer all of what today is Spain and Portugal. They conquer pretty much most of the southern half of France, and they're eventually stopped by the grandfather of Charlemagne, who was king of the Franks at the time, a man named Charles Martel.
They almost conquered Vienna.
Eventually, well, later on in the Ottoman period, so 17th century we're talking about there, yeah.
Okay.
But you're right, that's on the other side later on in history, though. It's the same principle. Yeah, the Battle of Vienna in 1674, I believe, somewhere in there, where they're defeated by the Christians. But that's another story, another fascinating story as well.
I know,
very
on one
famous.
of the podcasts, they focused very much
Right,
on the Polish knights that rode in.
Yeah, the winged hussars, who saved the day at the 11th hour, very famous. Anyway, yes, and so then you have this constant, they're eventually driven back out of France, and the Muslims settle in Spain. They rule Spain all the way up until eventually the Reconquista is completed in 1492. Okay? So you're talking Spain and Portugal were under Islamic occupation for 700 plus years.
So it's not really that the Crusades were trying to invade and kill all the Muslims. It was more a defensive thing. They were just trying to protect their own.
Correct. And what happens is that because people see this big journey of the First Crusade is largely made up of, it's a massive force. It's basically the biggest army
That was the ad hoc one, wasn't it, where they just picked up people along the way? Which was the one where...
No, you're thinking, yeah, that's the Peasants' Crusade or the People's Crusades.
Crusade? Yeah.
That's a little bit it's disconnected. The First Crusade was definitely very much a
An army.
concerted, yeah. An alliance, right? It's a massive. It's basically the biggest army at that point ever assembled, effectively since the Roman army.
Coming from
Western Europe, not England in the first. Eventually, later, the other Crusades, yes, especially the Third Crusade, was led by England. The First Crusade was led by the Normans, so you can think of them as the French, the Franks, right? The French, the Lombardians, the Burgundians, various other Germanic Western European peoples. Italo-Normans as well, obviously, those in Sicily.
Did they launch when, like, you know, Spain was being invaded, Italy was being invaded by...
Well, you've got, yeah, I mean, the Muslims had already, the Islamic caliphates of northern Africa had already conquered Sicily, like I mentioned, so Sicily and Calabria.
Yeah.
They then get driven out by the Normans, who conquer that and end the Islamic occupation. So they become known as the Italo-Normans, right? Blah, blah, blah. There's still constant back and forth in the Andalusian area between France and Spain. Spain has very much been settled and now conquered and very settled rule by Islam for about 300 years by this point.
That's because the Pyrenees sort of just excluded any sort of big armies getting across into
It makes it a lot more difficult, certainly, yeah. And you've also constantly got, what's really the impetus is that there's two major Islamic powers predominantly. You've got, at this time, by the time you get to the late 11th century AD, the biggest of them is the Great Seljuk Empire, and at least a bit more closer to the Byzantine Empire, the Christians, so the Eastern Roman Empire, the Christians, is the Sultanate of Rome, okay? Who have been very consistently chipping away. They were a new power in what today is Turkey, and they've been very quickly defeating the Byzantines, and Constantinople was now, the capital, was now very much under threat. So the Crusades, the whole impetus for the Crusades is the Eastern Christians, the Byzantine Empire, appealing to the Christians in the West, save us, to the Pope.
Yeah.
Right, so Alexios IV Komnenos, who's the Byzantine emperor at that time, sends a formal message to the Pope as a leading figure in Christendom in the West. Please convince the Western European monarchs to assemble an army. We're going to lose here, and our empire is going to fall, right? So the Byzantines are under an existential threat, like a deeply existential threat. They've already lost the majority of their empire over the last 400 or 500 years by that point to the various different Islamic caliphates, the Umayyad Caliphate, the Rashidun Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, etc., the Great Seljuk Empire, the Mamluk Sultanate, blah, 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 various different powers. Most of those Christian territories have now been forcibly converted to Christianity, all across North Africa, all across places like what today is like, Jordan, Israel, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. All those places are all Christian, by and large. Assyria, right, et cetera, et cetera. And so then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of constant invasion and warfare, and having lost most of their territory, majority of Eastern Christians now under Islamic occupation and rule, it eventually just reaches a breaking point where if that had have gone on for even a couple of decades more into the 12th century, Constantinople probably would have fallen then. It eventually falls later to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, 25th of September 1453, I believe. And so it happens eventually, but it was under threat then. So they're under an existential threat. What basically modern secular historians expect to have happened is that for some reason, Christians in the East or West or anywhere else should have just simply rolled over and died. Like it's just simply, on the academic level, it's just spite and hatred for Christians throughout history. On the more popular level, it's just sheer ignorance. They've heard shockingly little about the Crusades. The only thing they know is that they happened, and all they've ever heard is a passing reference to just basically these brutal Christians who just came over and, for absolutely no reason whatsoever, just decided to start slaughtering Muslims,
That's
who
ignorance.
are all just sitting around riding camels in the desert and sipping tea.
it's stupidity.
It's just utter ignorance. No, the Crusades were eminently justifiable. There are multitude of Crusades, not just in the Levant, right? So not just in the Middle East, those places like the Eastern Mediterranean. The Great Northern Crusade. I mentioned the Teutonic Knights earlier. That was later on. So the Baltic states, those countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, etc., were all pagan up until only about 500 years ago.
Really?
Oh,
That's
really?
more recent.
Yeah, that's the most. That was the Baltic states there, up around the Baltic Sea, were the last places in Europe to become Christian about 500 to 600 years ago.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's really recent.
Yeah. And
You were thinking that most of Europe and all that area were all done in like 200 or 300 AD, you know?
yeah, I mean, look, other than the Baltic states, the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, the Russians, Ukrainians, etc., blah blah, what would be today. Back then they weren't that distinguishable. But that was about 1000 AD. So
Right.
Vladimir the First, or Vladimir the Great, who was the ruler of the Kievan Rus, which is essentially historic Russia and Ukraine, he converts to Christianity on Christmas Day 1000.
1000.
Yeah.
Wow.
Gets baptized on the 25th of December 1000.
Who says the change of the millennium does nothing?
Yeah.
So this great army was going out to regain the land that they'd lost.
Absolutely, all those places. That's what I'm saying exactly. All the places they went. So they all meet. They all come by various ways. They're coming from Italy. They're coming from France. They're coming from southern Germany. What today's like Switzerland, Austria. All over. They're coming from all places in Western Europe. England's not involved yet. That's the second and especially the third crusade and onward. They lead the third crusade under Richard the Lionheart, King of England. But the first crusade, there's no Englishmen at that point. It's all Western Europeans. It's Italians and essentially what today is Italians and French and some Germans. They then come via various ways, marching their armies across Europe, sea, etc., and they arrive in Constantinople, right? The heart of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Christian Empire. And they then, from Constantinople, they then cross the Bosporus into Anatolia, right? The big bulk of what is Turkey today, and that's the Sultanate of Rome, right? So they're right on the doorstep almost.
Sorry, I missed it.
So this new Islamic power called the Sultanate of Rome, which is just the Turkish word for Rome, the Sultanate of Rome, because Constantinople was the new Rome,
was
the whole,
Rome,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. And so they then invade the Sultanate of Rome, right, or the Sultanate of Rome. They then defeat them quite easily, and they then are on the border of the much bigger power that lied behind the Sultanate of Rome, which was the Great Seljuk Empire, which had conquered and ruled basically the entirety of the Middle East for Islam.
Was that a word? Seljuk?
Seljuk, yes, that's the Seljuk people. They're a Turkic people. So the Seljuks, and they were. I won't bore you with the history of the Turkic migrations from Central Asia into what is today Turkey in the Middle East. But that's what happens. And so the Great Seljuk Empire was the foremost Islamic power at that time in the world.
When I talk to a few Muslims, right, they equate the actual the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq as just a continuation of the West carrying out yet another
Crusade.
Well, certainly, I mean, Al Qaeda colloquially referred to the war in Afghanistan and Iraq as the 10th Crusade.
So it's like they hold this grudge to this very day, sort of like, oh, this is just the West doing a crusade, invading us.
Correct, but that's the duplicity and the lies and the deception of making oneself a victim. There is no crusades. I'm telling you for a fact, there is no crusades without 400 years, more than 400 years actually, 400 years of constant Islamic invasions of the Christian world. That doesn't happen. It's not, and that's not up for debate. That's not up for discussion. It's just literally basic math. They happen. It's literally it's a cart and a horse thing. To say otherwise would be irrational and quite frankly insane. It's nonsensical.
Yeah.
The Islamic invasions come centuries prior to the Crusades. The Crusades are a counter-invasion. They're a response.
But that's all ignored. The actual Islamic.
No, entirely ignored.
Totally ignored.
And because the Crusades are an offensive war, what happens is people then if they're not understanding or versed in how military affairs work, offensive campaigns can be entirely done from a position of defense, and it doesn't show any depth at all of understanding of how warfare works. The guys on the offense are not necessarily the ones who are the aggressors. That's just not how that works, right? Otherwise, every counter-offensive, hence the word counter, would be taken as an act of aggression. It just doesn't make sense. This was effectively a counter-offensive 400 plus years in the making, right? Now, there are plenty of things that on the Crusades, again, there's multiple Crusades, there's at least, on a formal level, there's really kind of 9 Crusades across a period of about 200 years, from 1095 all the way to the fall of Acre in 1291. Right?
It's at least good that ISIS got the
300 years, let's say so. Yeah, sure, yeah. And so there's 9, but there's many other crusades that in and around that are small, that are isolated. I mean, the Great Northern Crusade of the Teutonic Order up into the Baltic, which went for about 100 years.
Wow.
That's not considered one of the crusade. When we think of the Crusades, we're generally talking about the ones into the Eastern Mediterranean world, right, the Levant.
Where they built forts and
all those things, yeah. The county of Tripoli, the county of Edessa, the kingdom of Jerusalem, all these various different crusader states that were established there. Yes, that's what that's talking about. There were the first 3 crusades are eminently justified and righteous without even the faintest question. The first, the second, and the third. The second crusade happens as a result of the Muslim re-invasion that happened as a result of the first. So you have a second one. Then after the days of King Baldwin IV, who's probably the greatest of the kings of Jerusalem, rules for about 10 years, had leprosy. We mentioned that earlier.
That's what that movie was based on.
Kingdom of Heaven. Oh yeah, the epic film. Yeah, he features. Yeah. Extended the director's cut if you can afford to, which is the better version. Yeah, King Baldwin IV is an absolute hero in Christian history. Comes to the throne at a very young age.
Who was that, sorry, Daniel?
King Baldwin IV, he was king of Jerusalem.
Yes,
right?
yes.
He was king from 1177 to 1189 off memory. Anyway, nevertheless, he had leprosy, had it from birth. Comes to the age of right, or in other words, the point that he can become king properly at the age of 15, wins his first major battle at the age of 16, Battle of Montgisard, 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 in 1177, when his army was outnumbered about 7-1. At the age of 16, he then passes away at the age of, I think, 24 or 26. I have to go back and have a look, from leprosy. An incredibly virtuous, yeah, I mean, just an utter hero. Every Christian should learn the story of King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. Utter hero. The amount of responsibility he brought peace and prosperity to Jerusalem that it had never experienced.
And Jerusalem only fell after he died, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah. So what happens is he dies. He has a very specific succession plan because there's a whole bunch of politicking going on in his time. But he brings a peace and prosperity for about a 10 or 11 year period there. Once he passes away, the throne goes to his successor. He, however, gets taken not long after that by another figure that he didn't want it to. I won't bore you with the details of name and years and whatever. But anyway, 1189 is when then the kingdom is reinvaded by Saladin who was the major,
Saladin.
who he defeated back at the Battle of Montgisard
He did, yeah.
in 1177.
Yeah.
And this is what then.
So the movie that is pretty accurate, and where it finishes with
Kingdom of Heaven, it's called. It was one of those, an epic film of 2004, I think.
Yeah, but it finishes where King
there's some
Richard
truth
is
in it, yeah.
asking him, was that King Richard's?
No, that's after that. That's when the Crusade happens. Yeah, I mean, Kingdom of Heaven's focused on. It takes some elements of historical truth.
Right.
Count of Year Beyond's not a real historical figure, but yeah, but it's a good enough movie either way.
Okay, I'm just curious as to how accurate it was.
No, there's plenty of historical accuracies in it. But yeah, so what happens is then, after his reign, the turmoil that comes, the re-invasion by the Muslims, is what brings about the Third Crusade.
Once you talk Crusades, it's a can of worms.
Led by,
Well, I was a bit worried about that.
and the Third Crusade originally had two very powerful kings, Richard the Lionheart, aka Richard I of England, and Henry the Third of France, or the third? I forget, maybe it was the second. No, I think it must have been Henry the Second, maybe. Henry the insert whatever number from France. Insert the second, Henry the Second or Henry the Third. I have to back and look. Anyway, he actually has to pull out, and then eventually actually dies trying to get there, trying to cross a river. So Richard the Lionheart becomes the foremost leader of the Third Crusade, and Richard the Lionheart was one of the greatest military commanders of the Middle Ages, and so they.
He's another one that's had a bad rap from.
Yeah, well, that's a tumultuous time in England's history. His father, Henry II, and he's got his brother, John I, who didn't do all that stellar of a job.
No, useless.
At all. That's what precipitates Magna Carta in 1215. Anyway, the Richard the Lionheart, and they barnstorm their way. They win basically almost every single battle and achieve absolutely everything except retaking Jerusalem. They win every single. They basically win every single other battle. Richard the Lionheart and others, including my ancestor, was on that one. Under Richard the Lionheart, who was a knight of the Holy Sepulchre, and they just stumble at the finish line, and they lose the Battle of Jerusalem in 1192, and to the Islamic forces, to the Mamluk Sultanate that they were fighting against, who had retaken it after Baldwin IV had passed away, which is what precipitated the whole.
That general that you mentioned before was
Salahuddin or Saladin.
He was still leading.
Was Saladin leading at that time? Yes, he was.
Because he was also
yes.
one of the greatest Muslim generals.
He is, yes, he was of all time, yeah, absolutely. And so the Third Crusade is overwhelmingly successful with that last asterisk of failing to retake. They retake everything else. They retake the entire kingdom of Jerusalem. They retake all the Count of Tripoli, they retake everything except the city of Jerusalem. But anyway, believe it or not, that is the short answer on the Crusades.
Thank you. I actually have a book I've just discovered, because I've just gone through all my books on the Templars
Crusade, yeah.
and all that stuff. So
It's a fascinating history, but no. What happens is that people are utterly ignorant of it. And as I'm saying, it's not about perfection. The Fourth Crusade is a dumpster fire. I'm not even bore you with that. The Fourth Crusade has really noble intentions that then completely diverts through just the corruption and greed of... Oh, well, that's now successes. The Fourth Crusade is now in the beginning of the 1200s. The plan was to actually go to the heart of the Mamluk Sultan. The Mamluks were from Egypt, right? So Islamic Egypt. And they planned the invasion of, in order to retake Jerusalem, let's first cut their knees out from under them by taking Egypt, right? They fail to take Egypt. They get close, but they fail. And then they're desperate for funds and other such things. So then they go up to Constantinople to resupply and everything else. But then there's a falling out between the Byzantines and the Crusaders, who already owed money to the Republic of Venice, who funded the whole expedition. And so now there's a fallout about disagreement. So then they actually besiege Constantinople and sack Constantinople.
Where Christians are killing Christians.
Who are the people who initially invited in the first place because of the disagreement over the... But anyway, it was a dumpster fire. So it's not a question of... But see, this is the difference. So you can be honest about when things go well and wrong, while not throwing baby out with bathwater. The Crusades, on the whole, especially the first three, but on the whole, were on the back end of 400 plus years of Islamic invasion and an existential threat, and tens of millions of Christians under Islamic occupation. that just gets
And the point that
utterly ignored.
that you got to remember is that Islamic conversion
Yep.
was that or death.
In many respects, absolutely. It was pay the jizya, which is a tax,
Yeah.
pay the tax for not being a Muslim,
Yeah.
or convert or die. That's essentially the three things.
Yeah.
So either convert or be extorted or die. Okay? And without understanding that, any viewpoint ever offered on the Crusades is worthless from the get-go. Like people, it's just not, it just comes from ignorance, and you can't just, these grand moral proclamations that people make without understanding even the faintest amount of detail. The amount of times I've had a conversation with someone who's been talking about how corrupt Christianity is and the Crusades and the Crusades and the Crusades, and then asking them when did the first one begin, and it's just like I asked them to explain quantum physics in Japanese or something. Like it's just, they don't even. You have these grand moral these grand moral views about this historical event, and you don't even know when they began. Like it's just wild. Like the ignorance and arrogance in the just combined into an utterly deadly
But it
cocktail.
hasn't changed this day. The Taliban still work that way. Convert or die.
I think she's locked herself out. We'll end it there.